Funny how people suddenly start treating you differently the moment you stop asking for permission to be yourself. Yesterday they could interrupt you, dismiss you, test your patience, and assume you'd keep explaining yourself just to keep everybody comfortable. Today you walk in with standards, boundaries, and a little less interest in being liked, and suddenly you're the problem. How convenient. They call it arrogance, because confidence makes insecure people uncomfortable, especially when they were benefiting from the version of you that never said no. But dominance isn't about controlling people or making everyone beneath you. Real power is controlling yourself, your emotions, your reactions, your time, your attention. You don't need to shout to prove you're in charge of your own life. You don't need to humiliate anybody. You don't need to win every argument. Sometimes the strongest move is simply refusing to participate in nonsense. Let them talk. Let them misunderstand. Let them create their little stories about why you've changed. They don't have to understand the transformation that happened inside you. They only have to notice the results. You became harder to manipulate because you started thinking before reacting. You became harder to disrespect because you stopped rewarding bad behavior with unlimited access. You became harder to distract because you finally decided your goals mattered more than somebody else's opinion. And yes, that can trigger people who were comfortable when you were easier to control. But don't turn their reaction into your identity either. You're not becoming powerful, so you can spend your life proving that you're powerful. You're becoming stronger so you can live with more freedom, more discipline, and more control over your own decisions, while the people waiting for the old version of you keep wondering where that person disappeared to, watching you become someone who no longer needs their approval to stand tall. Speak clearly, walk away, and choose what deserves your energy. There comes a point where you realize you've spent far too much time waiting for other people to approve decisions that were never theirs to make in the first place. And that's a strange realization, because suddenly you notice how many choices were shaped by somebody else's opinion. What they'd think, whether they'd be disappointed, whether they'd understand, whether they'd approve, whether they'd stay, and somewhere in all that noise you quietly stopped asking yourself what you actually wanted. That's how people lose control without even noticing. Nobody has to force you into a cage if they can convince you that you're supposed to ask permission before leaving it. Maybe you want to change careers, start something new, distance yourself from certain people, improve your appearance, pursue a difficult goal, or simply live differently from what everyone expected. And immediately the voices arrive. Are you sure? What will people say? That's not how we do things. Interesting. Everyone suddenly becomes an expert on your life when you're the one taking the risk. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Advice can be useful. Criticism can be useful. And wise people can help you see what you cannot see yourself. But approval is different. You can listen without surrendering your decision. You can respect someone's opinion without handing them the steering wheel. That's maturity. Real independence doesn't mean refusing every suggestion just to prove you're independent. It means choosing consciously after considering the information available to you. You don't need to become reckless. You need to become responsible for your own choices, because when you constantly blame other people for decisions you made to please them, you're still giving them power. Eventually you have to say, "This is my life, so I have to participate in deciding what happens next." That doesn't mean everyone will celebrate your choices. Some people will be disappointed. Some will misunderstand. Some may even become angry because the version of you they preferred was easier for them to influence. That's their reaction, not your responsibility. While you continue learning how to make decisions without requiring a room full of people to clap first, because confidence grows when you repeatedly prove to yourself that you can make a choice, handle the consequences, learn from mistakes, and adjust when necessary. And that is much stronger than pretending you're always right, because you're going to make mistakes. Everyone does. But a mistake made from your own considered decision can teach you something. While a life built entirely around other people's expectations can leave you wondering who you were actually living for. And once you stop asking permission for every move, you begin noticing how much energy was wasted trying to keep everyone comfortable. How often you stayed silent to avoid disagreement. How many opportunities you rejected because someone else might not approve. And how many dreams you quietly abandoned because they didn't fit the image somebody had created for you. While the world keeps demanding explanations, you can become more selective about what you explain and to whom, because not every decision requires a public defense. Sometimes, "This is what I've decided," is enough, and if someone doesn't understand, you don't have to spend 3 hours constructing a courtroom argument to convince them, because people are allowed to disagree with your choices, and you're allowed to continue making them, as long as you're willing to accept responsibility for the consequences, while you become less dependent on approval and more dependent on your own judgment, your preparation, your values, and your willingness to learn. And that's where genuine authority over your life begins, not in controlling other people, not in demanding respect, and certainly not in making anyone feel small, but in becoming someone who can stand behind a decision without needing everyone else to stand beside it. Because the strongest form of independence isn't saying, "Nobody can tell me what to do." It's being able to hear advice, examine it honestly, choose your path deliberately, and keep moving without needing permission to become the person you decided to become. People like to think power means making everyone else obey, but that's the cheap version of power, the noisy version, the version that needs an audience, because without someone to intimidate, there's nothing left to prove. Real control is much quieter. It's being able to feel anger without letting anger decide your next move. It's feeling embarrassed without immediately attacking someone. It's being criticized without collapsing or exploding. It's hearing something you don't like and still having enough control to pause before responding, because your emotions are real, but they are not always accurate instructions. Anger can tell you that a boundary was crossed, but it doesn't automatically tell you the smartest response. Fear can warn you about danger, but it doesn't mean every uncomfortable opportunity should be rejected. Jealousy can reveal insecurity, but it doesn't mean you need to destroy the person who triggered it. The emotion gives you information. You decide what to do with that information. That's where discipline begins. Most people don't lose control because they are weak. They lose control because they react before they think. Someone says one sentence, and suddenly they're typing a paragraph. Someone gives them a dirty look, and now they're planning revenge. Someone criticizes them online, and they spend an entire evening arguing with a stranger who will forget the conversation tomorrow. What a brilliant way to waste a perfectly good day. When you learn to pause, you interrupt the automatic reaction. Take a breath. Walk away if necessary. Give yourself time. Ask what outcome you actually want. Because sometimes the person who provoked you isn't the person controlling you. Your reaction is doing that job for them. If someone can make you abandon your values simply by irritating you, they have more influence over you than you realize. Emotional mastery changes that. You become harder to provoke because you stop treating every challenge as an emergency. You can disagree without becoming disrespectful. You can defend yourself without becoming destructive. You can leave without making a dramatic announcement. You can say, "I'm angry, but I'm not going to make a permanent decision while I'm angry." That's not weakness. That's control. And control doesn't mean suppressing emotions until they explode later. You need to understand what you're feeling, name it, examine it, and decide what response actually serves you. Sometimes the answer is confrontation. Sometimes it's distance. Sometimes it's an apology. Sometimes it's silence. Sometimes it's getting professional or trusted support. when the situation is bigger than you can handle alone. The point is that the choice becomes deliberate instead of automatic. While other people continue handing their emotions the steering wheel, and then wondering why their lives keep crashing into the same walls, you begin creating a gap between what happens and what you do next, and inside that gap is your freedom. Because nobody can completely control what you feel, but you can become much better at deciding what you do with those feelings. And that skill changes relationships, careers, goals, and even the way you see yourself. Because every time you respond thoughtfully instead of impulsively, you prove that you're capable of leading yourself. While every time you refuse to let anger make a decision that your calmer self would regret, you strengthen that ability, and eventually people notice that you don't react like you used to. Not because you've become emotionless, but because you've become selective about which emotions deserve action, which deserve reflection, and which simply need to pass, allowing you to stay composed when other people expect you to explode, stay focused when distractions are designed to provoke you, and remain yourself even when someone is trying very hard to turn you into a version of yourself you won't respect later. Because the strongest person isn't necessarily the loudest person in the room. Sometimes it's the person who has every reason to react, and still chooses the response that protects their future, their dignity, and their peace. I can't reproduce the exact voice of that character, but I can keep the dark, cynical, psychologically intense tone you want. Boundaries are funny, because people usually respect them only after they've benefited from you having none, and suddenly the moment you say no, protect your time, or refuse to tolerate disrespect, you're accused of changing, becoming cold, becoming difficult, or thinking you're better than everyone else, as if having limits were some kind of personal attack. But here's the truth: a boundary isn't a weapon. It's information. It tells people how they can treat you, what access they have to your life, and what happens when they cross a line. You don't need to scream. You don't need to threaten anyone. You don't need to create a dramatic scene every time someone behaves badly. You simply need to be consistent. That's where the power comes from. If you say you won't tolerate disrespect but continue rewarding it with your attention, your boundary isn't really a boundary. It's a suggestion. And people learn from what you repeatedly allow, not from what you occasionally announce. Maybe you've spent years answering every call, replying to every message, explaining every decision, forgiving every insult, and giving endless chances because you were afraid that saying no would make people leave. But look closely at that fear. If someone only stays when you have no limits, are they actually staying for you, or are they staying for the access you provide? That's an uncomfortable question, but sometimes uncomfortable questions are the useful ones. You don't need to cut everyone off. You need to become more selective about who receives your time, energy, trust, and attention. Healthy boundaries can be simple. I can't do that. I'm not comfortable with that. Please don't speak to me that way. I need some time. That doesn't work for me. Notice how none of those sentences require a courtroom defense. You don't have to provide 20 reasons before your no becomes legitimate. Your time matters even when someone else doesn't understand why. Your privacy matters even when someone calls you secretive. Your peace matters even when somebody thinks you should tolerate their chaos. And yes, some people will react badly. That's not always proof that your boundary is wrong. Sometimes it's proof that the old arrangement benefited them. When you change the rules of access, people who are comfortable with unlimited access may complain, while people who genuinely respect you will usually adapt, communicate, or at least recognize that you're allowed to have limits, because healthy relationships don't require one person to constantly surrender themselves to keep the other person comfortable. And if you have to abandon your dignity every time someone becomes upset, you're not maintaining peace. You're purchasing temporary silence with pieces of yourself, while you slowly become resentful. because you're giving more than you actually want to give. And resentment is often what happens when people repeatedly say yes with their mouths while everything inside them is screaming no. So learn to say no earlier, before irritation becomes anger, before disappointment becomes bitterness, and before a small boundary becomes a massive explosion, because clear boundaries create clarity, and clarity prevents unnecessary drama, allowing you to remain respectful without becoming endlessly available, generous without becoming exploitable, and compassionate without becoming responsible for everyone's emotions. While you stop explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you, and start communicating with people capable of respecting your position, because your goal isn't to control how others react to your boundaries. Your goal is to control whether you enforce them. And that distinction changes everything. You cannot force someone to respect your limits, but you can decide what you will do when they repeatedly ignore them. You can step back, reduce access, end the conversation, leave the environment, seek support, or protect yourself through appropriate practical steps, because boundaries become powerful when they are connected to action rather than empty threats. And eventually you stop seeing boundaries as walls designed to keep everyone away, and start seeing them as doors with handles that you control, deciding who enters, how close they come, and when it's time to close the door, while the people who genuinely value you learn that your boundaries aren't rejection. They're part of the structure that makes a healthy relationship possible, and the people who disappear because you finally developed standards reveal something you needed to know, leaving you with fewer unnecessary battles, clearer relationships, and more room to build a life where access to you is earned through respect rather than demanded through guilt, pressure, or, I can't reproduce the exact voice of that character, but I can keep the dark, cynical, psychologically intense tone you want. There is something almost hilarious about people who spend all day announcing what they're going to become while doing absolutely nothing that would make it true. Because talking is cheap and promises are wonderfully convenient when nobody can measure them. You can tell everyone you're disciplined, confident, successful, powerful, focused, and completely unbothered, but eventually reality asks the only question that matters: where is the evidence? That's why you should stop trying so hard to prove yourself and start letting your actions speak. You don't need to win every argument. You don't need to explain every improvement. You don't need to tell everyone who doubted you that you're finally doing well. Build quietly. Work consistently. Let the results become impossible to ignore. Because when you constantly announce your intentions, you create pressure to perform for an audience, and suddenly you're not building your life anymore. You're managing everyone's expectations about your life. That's exhausting. Imagine spending more energy explaining your future than creating it. You don't need that circus. If you're improving your health, keep going. If you're building a business, keep learning. If you're developing a skill, practice when nobody is watching. If you're becoming more disciplined, let your routine demonstrate it. If you're changing your relationships, let your boundaries demonstrate it. People don't need a speech explaining that you've changed. They'll notice when your behavior changes. They'll notice when you stop reacting to the same provocations. They'll notice when you stop accepting the same disrespect. They'll notice when you become more reliable, more focused, and less interested in unnecessary drama. That's real evidence. And here's the beautiful part. Results don't need to argue. A completed project doesn't need to insult the person who doubted you. A healthier body doesn't need to announce revenge. A successful business doesn't need to scream at every critic. A calm response doesn't need to prove that you're stronger. The evidence simply exists. That's why consistency is more powerful than intensity. Anyone can have one extraordinary day. Anyone can make a dramatic promise at midnight. Anyone can become motivated after watching a powerful video. But what happens on the ordinary Tuesday when nobody cares? That's where your character shows up. Keep going when the excitement disappears. Keep working when the compliments stop. Keep improving when nobody notices. Because the life you want is usually built during the boring moments that don't look impressive from the outside. While everyone else is busy announcing their next move, you can be quietly completing yours, and eventually the gap between what people say and what they actually do becomes obvious, not because you exposed anyone, but because reality has a way of keeping score without needing your help. And that's why you don't have to chase people who underestimated you, correct every rumor, answer every criticism, or prove every accusation wrong. Because as every minute spent defending your potential is a minute you could have spent developing it. While the people who once dismissed you continue talking, you continue working, and eventually your progress becomes the response, not because you're trying to humiliate anyone, but because you finally understand that your life is too valuable to turn into a courtroom where you're constantly presenting evidence that you deserve respect. And the more you build, the less interested you become in explaining yourself, because confidence doesn't always say, "Watch me." Sometimes it says nothing at all and simply keeps moving, while your habits become stronger, your skills become sharper, your decisions become wiser, and your results begin speaking in a language that doesn't require translation, allowing you to stop chasing validation and start collecting evidence for yourself. Evidence that you can keep promises, recover from setbacks, learn from mistakes, and create something meaningful through consistent effort. And once you have that evidence inside you, other people's opinions lose some of their ability to shake you, because you know what you've actually done, not what you intended to do, not what you promised to do, and not what you hoped people would believe about you, but what you repeatedly did when nobody was watching. And that is the kind of proof that doesn't disappear. When the applause stops, I can't reproduce the exact voice of that character, but I can keep the dark, cynical, psychologically intense tone you want the moment you start building your life around other people's reactions. You hand them a remote control and then act surprised when they keep pressing the buttons, because suddenly their approval determines your mood. Their criticism determines your confidence, their jealousy determines your choices, and their silence determines whether you think you matter. That's a terrible arrangement. And the funniest part is that some of these people aren't even thinking about you nearly as much as you imagine. They're busy with their own problems, their own insecurities, their own ambitions, and their own little dramas, while you're spending precious energy trying to predict what they might think about your next move. Stop. You don't need to become powerful so you can trigger people. You don't need to succeed just to make an ex regret losing you. You don't need to improve your appearance because someone once insulted you. You don't need to build a career just to prove your family wrong. Those goals may give you temporary motivation, but they can become another form of control if your entire identity depends on somebody else's reaction. Real freedom begins when you can succeed without needing them to notice. You can grow without announcing it. You can become healthier without posting evidence. You can set boundaries without waiting for someone to call you strong. You can walk away without secretly hoping they'll chase you. That's the difference between living for yourself and performing for an audience. If someone is impressed, fine. If they're not, fine. If they celebrate you, appreciate it. If they criticize you unfairly, examine whether there's anything useful in it and leave the rest behind. Their reaction doesn't need to become your identity. People will interpret your choices through their own experiences, and you cannot control that. Someone may call confidence arrogance. Someone may call boundaries selfishness. Someone may call discipline obsession. Someone may call independence coldness. If you spend your life correcting every interpretation, you'll never have enough time to actually live. Listen to reasonable feedback, but don't confuse feedback with authority. You are allowed to decide which opinions deserve weight. That's not arrogance. That's discernment. And if somebody becomes angry because you are no longer available for manipulation, don't immediately assume you did something wrong. Sometimes a person's reaction reveals what they expected to receive from you, while you keep becoming more disciplined, more stable, and more focused. Their approval becomes less necessary, because your satisfaction starts coming from the process itself, from knowing you kept your word, improved your skills, protected your peace, and made decisions consistent with your values. Because the goal isn't to become someone everyone respects. That's impossible. The goal is to become someone you respect. And when that happens, other people's reactions become information rather than instructions. You can notice them without obeying them, learn from them without being controlled by them, and move forward without constantly checking the room for permission. While some people may celebrate your growth, and others may feel threatened by it, you don't have to choose your path based on either reaction, because your life shouldn't be a performance designed to create jealousy, admiration, fear, or regret. It should be a process of becoming more capable, more grounded, and more aligned with what actually matters to you. And that requires emotional independence. The ability to let someone misunderstand you without immediately defending yourself. The ability to let someone leave without chasing them. The ability to hear criticism without collapsing. And the ability to receive praise without becoming addicted to it, while you continue moving toward your goals whether anyone is watching or not. Because the strongest kind of dominance is not controlling another person's emotions. It's refusing to let another person's emotions control yours. And once you understand that you stop trying to win invisible competitions, stop collecting imaginary enemies, and stop measuring your progress by the number of people who react to it, allowing your attention to return to your own work, your own growth, your own relationships, and your own future, while the world continues reacting however it wants, you remain responsible for the only reaction you can truly control, your own. And that is where the real freedom begins. When their applause doesn't make you arrogant, their silence doesn't make you desperate, and their anger doesn't make you abandon yourself, because you finally understand that your life is too valuable to be managed by somebody else's mood.